The smell of an old basement, that damp, earth and musty. Air scent clung to the park. As damp timber as Felix Young crouched, his medical examiner, as flashlight beam cutting through the gale, as howl, battery gauge 12%. The park generators had failed an hour ago, leaving only the wind's metallic rask against the cabin's metal roof, a sound like fur being dragged across glass. He'd documented this trail twice already. Crimson footprints, each 8 inches deep, glowing with an electric violet intensity that seemed to pulse against the deep shadow of the forest. They led straight toward his cabin door, a path marked by something that didn't belong in the Age of Enlightenment, a dark side. The footprints smelled faintly of copper, like old blood left to dry on wet parchment, a scent that triggered a memory of a morgue drawer sliding open, cold and sharp. Felix shifted his weight, the soles of his boots pressing into the packed earth near the cabin's foundation. Beneath the wind, roar, a sound like ice sheets fracturing under immense pressure. He heard it again, not the storm, separate, a distinct, brittle crack, like a twig snapping underfoot, yet deeper, older, resonating up through the soles of his boots. He froze, the flashlight beam fixed on the drain cover near the door. As threshold, the metal grate, rusted green at the edges, had been slightly askew for days, but now it shifted. A slow, wet metallic Krieg-grained, like a hinge resisting corrosion. The shift revealed not just mud, but a faint, damp trail beneath the cover, glistening with that same unnatural violet light as the crimson footprints had. He knelt, the damp earth soaking through his trousers, the scent of decay from the drain cover overwhelming, the smell of stagnant water and something older like forgotten graves. His gloved fingers traced the edge of the drain grate, the cold metal biting through the fabric. The footprints didn't just lead free to the door. They seemed to flow toward it, each impression deeper, brighter than the last. He'd seen crime scene photos where the aftermath screamed violence, but this was different. This felt like a residue, a physical echo of something that had passed through. He thought of the inciting incident, the sudden power outage, the glowing footprints appearing like a map drawn in blood under the park, as failing lights. The wind howled again, a sound like 1,000 frozen bones scraping together. The drain cover shifted again, a slow, deliberate, furty creak of metal yielding. The faint, wet trail beneath it darkened, becoming visibly slick, reflecting the flashlight beam in oily streaks. Felix's breath fogged in the cold air, his medical eye cataloguing the anomaly. The trail wasn't tea water. It was something thinner, colder, moving against the current of the storm. The violet light from the footprints seemed to pulse in time with the deep, rhythmic thump of his own heartbeat, a sound he'd never noticed before. The wind's metallic rasp intensified, a sound like a clockwork gear grinding against itself, echoing the rhythm of the single eye he glimpsed in the forest shadows earlier. The park's usual wildlife. He leaned closer, the flashlight beam now illuminating the drain cover. This opening, the wet trail led straight into the darkness beneath. The wind's howl softened for a fraction of a second, replaced by the sound of something small, cold, and deliberate shifting in the mud. Then, without warning, the drain cover slid fully aside. A pale hand, fingers stiffened like frozen twigs, emerged slowly, deliberately from the wet darkness beneath the cabin's foundation. It hovered just above the glowing violet trail, the skin almost translucent, veins like thin electric violet threads. The hand did not move toward him. It simply froze out a silent, impossible thing in the storm's heart. The flashlight beam trembled in Felix's hand, the battery gauge flickering to 11%. The scalpel slid under the rusted edge of the drain cover, a grating screech that resonated not just in the wind-whipped air, but tough inside my skull. A high-pitched whine, building with each millimeter of lift, until it felt like the bone behind my ear was vibrating in sympathy. The metal protested, slick with something beyond the storm's dampness, and finally yielded with a wet clunk. Beneath, not mud, not just water, but a coiled darkness, and something silver. I angled the flashlight beam down the beam's edge, blurring in the swirling mist. It was a whistle. Small, intricately carved, tarnished with age, but undeniably silver. I hooked it with the scalpel, drawing it free. The metal felt unnaturally cold, even through my gloves, a cold that seemed to leach the heat from my hand. Engraved across the surface in a spidery script I hadn't noticed before were two initials, EL. The metallic grinding intensified, but it wasn't the wind, wasn't the storm. It was signed inside my ear canal now, a high-frequency whine that resonated with the whistle's chill. It climbed, a rising pitch, almost beyond the threshold of hearing, and then a pressure, a feeling of something pressing against my eardrum, not painfully but insistently. I turned the whistle over in my hand, examining the carving. The metal was smooth, worn, as if countless hands had held it, traced the initials. The violet glow from the footprints seemed to cling to it, a faint luminescence that pulsed in time with the internal grinding. I glanced at the footprints again. They hadn't shifted, but the way the light played on the damp earth, it wasn't random. It mimicked the path I'd taken hours earlier, retracing my steps from the generator shed. The same angle, the same depth, an echo, a perfect glowing echo. Then it appeared, not from the trees, not from the shadows, but from the periphery of my vision, a flicker of movement. A shape coalescing out of the grey. The cat. It moved with a liquid grace, as if unburdened by gravity, padding through the mud without disturbing a single droplet. The single clockwork gear replacing its left eye glinted in the flashlight beam, a cold metallic stare. It didn't blink. It didn't react to the storm. It simply tuiwasied. It settled a few feet away, regarding me with an unsettling stillness. Its fur, a matted, oily black, seemed to absorb the light, leaving only the glint of the gear and the unnervingly focused gaze of the remaining eye. The grinding in my ear reached a fever pitch, a shrill whine that threatened to overwhelm my senses. I raised the whistle, turning it over in my fingers. Its reflection in the polished metal of the gear caught my eye, not the cat's reflection, my pooed face. Pale, strained, illuminated by the flashlight and the violet glow. But something was wrong. The reflection wasn't quite right. The angles were off, the features subtly distorted. It was like looking at a photograph of myself, aged and weary, a ghost of a man I hadn't yet become. The cat's head tilted, a slow, deliberate movement. The gear whirred, a faint clicking sound that mingled with the internal grinding, and then it spoke. Not a meow, not a hiss, but a voice. My voice, but not a deeper resonance, a timbre I hadn't known I possessed. Not Felix, it said. The sound seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly within my skull. The grinding in my ears ceased. A hollow stillness descended, heavier and more unsettling than the storm. Hey, the GPS blinked, a sickly green in the gloom. The footprints continued, a violet luminescence tracing a path deeper into the woods. Each tree trunk emitted a protracted screech, a metallic groan that vibrated through the soles of my boots and up into my teeth. It wasn't either wind, it was the trees themselves protesting my passage. The air tasted of ozone and something else, something sharp and acrid like burnt sugar. I consulted the GPS again, verifying the coordinates. The path mirrored my own, 3 hours prior. A perfect glowing echo, laid out in the mud. It was illogical, a mockery of cause and effect. I registered the anomaly, filed it away. Emotional response was a liability. Observation, cataloging, analysis, speedivos were the tools of the trade. The storm intensified, the wind tearing at my coat, whipping rain into my face. Each gust carried a whisper too faint to decipher, but persistent enough to prick at the edges of my awareness. A name, perhaps, or a fragment of a memory struggling to surface. I ignored it. The cat watched, motionless, immobile. Its gear, I a cold silver disc reflecting the violet glow of the footprints. I continued forward, the GPS guiding me deeper into the woods, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the rising tide of unease. The ground beneath my feet shifted, a subtle give beneath the fallen leaves, not soft earth, but something hollow. A pocket watch materialized at my feet, not dropped, not placed, simply there, tarnished silver, its face obscured by a film of grime. I bent, the movement stiff in the cold, and picked it up. The metal was unexpectedly warm, a stark contrast to the chill of the storm. I wiped away the grime, revealing the face. 17:04 a.m. The precise moment the power had failed, the screeching from the trees escalated, a cacophony of tortured metal. The wind seemed to coalesce, swirling around me, pressing against my skin. The air thickened, becoming heavy, viscous. I felt a pressure in my chest, a tightening that stole my breath. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of dread. The GPS led me to a clearing, a small circular space devoid of undergrowth. In the center stood a single oak, its branches gnarled and twisted like the limbs of a drowning man. The violet glow clung to the bark, illuminating the intricate patterns of the grain. The cat sat at the base of the tree, its eye fixed on me. I ran a diagnostic on the GPS. No errors. The signal was strong. The path was clear. The footprints continued, leading directly to the base of the oak. I felt a tremor in my hands, a subtle vibration that resonated with the screeching of the trees. The air crackled with static electricity, raising the hairs on my arms. I approached the oak, the GPS guiding my every step. The ground beneath my feet became increasingly uneven, littered with roots and stones. The scent of ozone intensified, burning my nostrils. I felt a strange disorientation, a sense of unreality that threatened to overwhelm my senses. The forest seemed to breathe, the trees swaying in a silent rhythm. The cat remained motionless, a silent sentinel guarding the base of the oak. I noticed something new. Carved into the trunk, almost invisible beneath the violet glow, were symbols, not letters, not numbers, something else entirely. Geometric patterns, intricate and unsettling, they pulsed with a faint, internal light. I reached out, tracing the symbols with my gloved finger. A jolt of energy surged through my arm, a tingling sensation that spread through my entire body. The symbols seemed to shift, to rearrange themselves, forming new patterns, new meanings. I felt a presence in my mind, a subtle intrusion that threatened to overwhelm my thoughts. The cat spoke again. "The path is not what you see, Elias." The voice was my own, yet distorted, layered with an unfamiliar resonance. It resonated not in my ears, but in the bone of my skull, a vibration, a tremor. The screeching of the trees reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that threatened to shatter my eardrums. I stumbled backward, clutching my head, trying to block out the noise, the voice, the intrusion. The GPS flashed, displaying a new coordinate. A location I didn't recognize. A place I hadn't been. A place I was heading towards. The footprints in the mud had changed direction. They were leading me away from the path I'd taken, leading me back to myself. The silver whistle felt cold against my palm, a manufactured chill that seeped into my bones. I raised it, the tarnished metal reflecting the violet glow of the oak, and blew, not a melodious tone, but a strangled wheeze, a desperate expulsion of air. Immediately, my name Soin Foy Liasi whispered from the drain at my feet. Not a shout, not a clear utterance, but a fragmented sigh, a breath exhaled from the earth itself. The name felt wrong, a violation, Felix. My name is Felix Young. The world shuddered. Not a tremor, not a quake, but a reversal. The trees snapped backward, their branches retracting, shedding leaves that spiraled not downward, but toof into the drain. A torrent of crimson and gold, a sudden violent undoing of autumn. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of displaced earth, and the metallic tang of something ancient. The winds howling morphed, the gale twisting into a discordant chorus, a grinding of gears and splintering wood that resonated within my skull. It was the sound of time itself unspooling. My feet stumbled on the uneven ground, the disorientation profound. The violet light intensified, a pulsating luminescence that seemed to warp the very air around me. The cat, its gear, a malevolent silver disk, remained motionless, an immobile observer of this impossible phenomenon. A pressure built behind my eyes, a throbbing ache that threatened to crack my skull. The trees, the ground, the air, everything was moving backward, yet I remained stubbornly, terrifyingly. Fudi-ha-ha, my hands trembled, not from cold, but from a visceral primal fear, a fear not of the unknown, but of the unmaking. The sensation of falling, not downwards, but tivenwards, a collapsing of space and time. The memory of my mother's face, the taste of rain on my tongue, the feel of sunlight on my skin, horn fractured, dissolving into the backward rush. I fought against it, anchoring myself to the present, to the reality I knew, however precarious it felt. The GPS, still clutched in my hand, flickered, displaying a jumble of meaningless symbols before resolving into a single stark message: error. The trees continued their backward dance, the leaves swirling into the drain, a vortex of color and decay. The screeching intensified, a chorus of tortured metal that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of existence. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to push it, but my limbs felt leaden, my voice trapped in my throat. The cat's gear eye seemed to bore into my soul, a cold, calculating gaze that stripped away any pretense of control. A voice not spoken, but implanted, resonated within my mind. The sequence is incomplete, Elias. The voice was mine, yet not mine. A mimicry, a grotesque parody of my own tone. It resonated not in my ears, but directly within the bone of my skull, a vibration that made my teeth ache. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself against the onslaught of sensory input. The backward rush intensified, the world collapsing around me. The smell of ozone became overwhelming, choking me. The taste of something bitter and metallic coated my tongue. I felt a presence not external, but tubby internal, a subtle intrusion that threatened to consume my consciousness. I opened my eyes, blinking against the violet light. The trees had nearly completed their reversal, their branches now pointing towards the sky, their roots exposed, reaching back into the earth. The leaves continued to spiral into the drain, a silent, hypnotic dance. The cat remained motionless, its gear eye fixed on me, a silent judge of my failure. The world stabilized, the backward rush subsiding. The trees stood still, their leaves suspended in midair before slowly, agonizingly, falling. The screeching diminished, fading into a low, guttural hum. The air thinned, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. The GPS remained frozen, displaying the error message. I looked down at my hands. They trembled, not from cold, but from a deep, unsettling exhaustion. By name, Derviasin, the whisper from the drain, the backward rush, the cat's voice. They were fragments of something larger, something incomprehensible, something terrifying. I felt a compulsion, a sudden, overwhelming urge to understand, to unravel the mystery, to find the source of this distortion. The path ahead, previously obscured by the backward flow, now lay clear. But it was not the path I had taken. It led not forward, but back. Back to a place I didn't recognize, a place that felt both familiar and alien, a place that called to me with a siren song of madness. The footprints in the mud had shifted, mirroring my own, but leading in a direction I hadn't intended. They were guiding me back to myself. The ridge was a spine of rock, jutting into the violet-stained sky. Each step crunched, a brittle protest against the frozen earth. The whistle, a cold weight in my palm, felt less like an object and more like a parasitic limb. I stopped at the crest. The wind tearing at my coat, a relentless rasp against my ears below. The ravine yawned, a dark gash in the landscape. I dropped the whistle. It disappeared into the gloom with a faint metallic click. The static began then. Not a sound, not precisely, but a crawling sensation across my skin, like a million tiny insects skittering beneath the surface. The violet deepened, saturating the world, bleeding into the grey sky. The wind's howl fractured, splintering into a chorus of metallic groans and whines, like the tormented song of a machine. It resonated in my teeth, a physical pressure, the cat. It materialized from the swirling violet padding silently up the ridge. Its gear eye, a silver disc reflecting the distorted light, swiveled, fixing me in its gaze. No warmth, no curiosity, just a cold, assessing calculation. It moved with an unnatural grace, its paws leaving no trace on the frozen ground. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of ozone, and something else, something acrid and unfamiliar, like burnt sugar and decay. I braced myself, the static intensifying, a tangible vibration that rattled my bones. My vision swam, the violet light blurring the edges of reality. I felt a compulsion to speak, to articulate something, but the words wouldn't form. My throat constricted, a dry, painful ache. The cat stopped a few feet away, its gear eye unwavering. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt, the world momentarily inverted. I clung to the solidity of the rock, anchoring myself against the disorienting shift. My pulse hammered in my ears, a frantic drumbeat against the metallic whine of the wind. The taste of copper coated my tongue, a bitter, unwelcome presence. I focused on the cat, on the precise geometry of its mechanical eye, desperately seeking a point of stability in the swirling chaos. The landscape seemed to breathe, the trees inhaling and exhaling with a slow rhythmic pulse. The feeling of falling, not downwards, but typhontotoids, threatened to overwhelm me. I clenched my fists, digging my nails into the frozen earth. The cat's head tilted, a subtle movement that somehow conveyed an unsettling amusement. A pressure built behind my eyes, a dull, throbbing ache that resonated with the metallic whine of the wind. I wanted to look away, to break the connection, but I was trapped, held captive by that cold, calculating gaze. The scent of ozone intensified, stinging my nostrils. My memories felt distant, fragmented, like shards of glass scattered across a frozen plain. The world felt wrong, utterly, fundamentally wrong. The static peaked, a searing wave that washed over me, momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, the cat was closer. It hadn't moved, but the distance between us seemed to have diminished. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing myself from afar, a puppet dancing to an unseen tune. The wind howled, a mournful lament that seemed to penetrate my very soul. The ground vibrated beneath my feet, a low, resonant hum that resonated within my skull. My thoughts felt sluggish, thick with a viscous residue. The landscape swam, the trees blurring into indistinct shapes. The feeling of falling intensified, a relentless pull towards an unknown abyss. I struggled to maintain my grip on reality, clinging to the memory of my mother's face, the warmth of sunlight on my skin, but the memories were fading, dissolving into the violet static. The cat opened its mouth. Not a meow, not a hiss, but a voice that resonated not in my ears, but directly within my skull. A voice that was mine. You buried your sister in the basement. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. The static intensified, the violet light pulsed, and the ground beneath me tilted violently. I staggered, grabbing onto a stunted pine for support. The voice echoed, a mocking repetition of the words, "You buried your sister in the basement." My blood turned to ice. The memory suppressed for years surfaced with brutal clarity. The damp chill of the basement, the smell of earth and decay, the weight of the shovel in my hands. It wasn't a memory, not precisely, more like a reconstruction, a fabrication, a lie. The scalpel felt cold, alien in my hand, a surgeon's tool repurposed for this, for ending something already gone. The cat's gear eye, a malevolent silver disc, didn't flinch. It simply observed, that calculating gaze dissecting my intent. The wind screamed, a high-pitched whine that resonated in the marrow of my bones, each gust a physical shove. I lunged. The blade bit into the mechanism, a grinding metallic shriek that tore through the wind's lament. Glass shattered, not just the clockwork gears, but something within my skull itself. A cascade of icy fragments, a brief blinding flash of violet and shadow, the static intensified, a searing pressure against my temples. My vision blurred, the landscape warping like a heat mirage. The taste of iron flooded my mouth, a bitter, unwelcome tide. You buried your sister in the basement. The voice echoed, a phantom limb of my own consciousness. It clung to the edges of my perception, a persistent, irritating drone. I ignored it, focused on the immediate, the visceral act of retribution. The cat staggered, its mechanical eye leaking a viscous black fluid that smelled of burnt sugar and ozone. It emitted a sound, not a meow, not a hiss, but a grinding whir, a mechanical death rattle. My legs moved, propelling me forward, a desperate, ungainly sprint towards the cabin. The ground was frozen, treacherous, each step a precarious negotiation with gravity. The wind tore at my coat, a relentless, icy hand. I didn't look back, didn't dare. The voice persisted, a mocking counterpoint to the pounding of my heart. You buried your sister in the basement. The footprints. They led directly to the cabin door, stark impressions in the frozen earth. Each one a perfect replica of a human boot, but subtly wrong, subtly distorted. I didn't examine them closely, didn't want to. The cabin loomed, a dark silhouette against the violet sky. A familiar shape, yet somehow altered. The wood seemed darker, the windows more vacant. I approached the door, the static building to a crescendo. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. The metal was cold, slick beneath my fingers. A faint, rhythmic clicking emanated from within, a subtle counterpoint to the wind's howl. I braced myself, expecting resistance, a locked door, a barrier, but the knob turned easily, too easily. The door swung inward with a silent groan, revealing a hallway swallowed by shadow. The smell of dust and decay was overwhelming, a palpable weight in the air. A single flickering candle cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, painting grotesque shapes that writhed and shifted in my peripheral vision. The voice swelled, a chorus of whispers now, a cacophony of accusation. You buried your sister in the basement. I stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind me with a finality that resonated deep within my chest. The static receded slightly, but the pressure remained. A dull, throbbing ache behind my eyes. I raised my hand, expecting to see my reflection in the dusty mirror hanging by the door. Instead, I saw Fifime. Not me, not Felix Young. A man stared back, his face etched with a grim determination I didn't recognize. His eyes were the same haunted grey, but something was different. Something older, harder. A cruel twist of the lips, a tightening of the jaw. The reflection mouthed a single word. Elias! The word struck me with the force of a physical blow. Elias, my father's name. A name I hadn't heard spoken in decades. A name I'd buried alongside my sister. The cabin seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the shadows pressing down. The flickering candlelight cast grotesque shadows that danced and writhed, mocking my confusion. The scent of ozone intensified, stinging my nostrils, the footprints. They were everywhere now, not just outside the door, but on the floor of the hallway, leading deeper into the cabin. They were my footprints. Elias's footprints, a trail of evidence, a silent accusation. The voice intensified, a triumphant roar within my skull. You buried your sister in the basement. I wanted to scream, to deny, to lash out, but the words wouldn't form. My throat constricted, a dry, painful ache. I was trapped, a puppet dancing to an unseen tune. The world tilted, the floor beneath me seeming to shift and sway. I clung to the solidity of the wall, anchoring myself against the disorienting shift. The cabin felt wrong, utterly, fundamentally wrong. The metallic whine returned, a subtle vibration that resonated within my bones. The air inside the cabin tasted of rust and something older, something like the inside of a locked chest after a century. My breath fogged in the violet gloom, each exhalation a fleeting ghost against the shadows. The hallway stretched before me, a corridor of silence, except for the faint, rhythmic foot-tick, click-kick of the doll's footprints small. Deliberate impressions in the dust, leading deeper into the cabin. I didn't follow them, couldn't. The voice in my skull had sharpened into a blade, carving into the soft tissue of my thoughts. You buried your sister in the basement, or tried to. My fingers brushed the wallpaper, peeling like sun-baked skin. Beneath it, the wood groaned, a sound like a joint loosening in an old man's spine. The shadows here were different, thicker. They didn't cling to corners. They breathed. A slow, deliberate inhalation from the darkness, as if the cabin itself were waiting. I moved forward. The floorboards creaked, but not under my weight. Under Twither-sea, the footprints Elias's, mine, hers all tangled together now, a grotesque waltz across the warped oak. The candle flickered, and for a moment, the shadows took shape, a child's outline too thin, too still. A doll's head tilted, its painted smile splitting into something wet and wrong. The stench of rotting fabric hit me then. Cloying and sweet, like the inside of a grave after the rain. I didn't see it at first, not the doll. Not the way it sat perched on the edge of a table, its glass eyes reflecting the candlelight like shattered ice. It was small, no larger than my hand, its once white dress now stained the color of dried blood. The fabric clung to its limbs in damp folds, as if it had been pulled from a pond. The air around it warped, just for a second a distortion, like heat rising from pavement, but wrong. The doll's head turned, not with a joint, with a sound, a wet, tearing noise like parchment being ripped from a spine. The glass eyes followed me, not with tracking, not with life, with togulation. The voice in my skull shifted, deeper now, richer, like a man speaking through water. You let her drown. You stayed. God, I didn't remember that. I didn't remember thought, any of it. My fingers twitched, the scalpel still warm from the cat's eye pressed into my palm. The urge to cut, to sever, to fixie something clawed at me. But not here, not now. The doll's head tilted further, its painted mouth parting in a silent scream. The shadows behind it twin-moved stretching like tar, pooling at its feet. Not a shadow, a thing goodly. A child's shape, but wrong, too many limbs, too many joints, its skin the color of old bruises. The candle guttered. The voice hissed, "Too stayed." You stayed. The doll's head snapped forward, its glass eyes tree-popped, black fluid oozing down its cheeks like melted wax. The air thickened, a physical weight pressing against my ribs. The thing in the shadows lunged. Not at me, at the doll, its fingers too long, too thin, wrapped around the doll's throat. The fabric tore with a sound like tearing silk. The doll's head lolled back, its mouth opening wider, wider. The cat's voice cut through the silence. Not from the hallway, not from the walls, from twinside me. You stayed. The doll's body unraveled, thread by thread, the stitching splitting like rotting sinew. The shadows swallowed it whole, the candle snuffed out, and in the sudden dark, the cat's voice whispered one last time, "You stayed." The cat's eye was warm in my palm, its brass cilia still twitching like a dying insect's legs. The rusted clockwork gear pulsed faintly, a slow, irregular throb against my skin. Fun talk, talk as if the thing still had a heartbeat. I hadn't meant to take it. Not really, but the way it had stared at me from the socket, one glass eye dry and cracked, the other a hollow void of oil and gears, made my fingers twitch. The scalpel had been easy, too easy. The blade slid through flesh like it was butter, the resistance minimal, almost welcoming. The cat didn't so much as flinch. No yowl, no thrash, just a wet thplink as the eye dropped into my waiting hand, still glistening with something dark and thick. The cabin air smelled of burned sugar now, the scent clinging to the back of my throat like syrup. My fingers curled around the eye, the gears grinding faintly as I turned it in the light. The doll sat on the table, its ragdoll body lolling like a broken marionette. The candle flame guttered, casting long fingers of violet across its stained dress. I didn't know why I was doing this. Didn't know why the voice in my skull had stopped hissing and started demanding. But my arm moved before my brain could catch up. The eye pressing into the doll's empty socket with a sound like a cork popping from a bottle. The fabric of its face split with a wet sun snap, the stitching parting like rotten sinew. The eye didn't fit cleanly. The brass cilia snagged, the gears jamming against the doll's dried-out skin. I twisted it, and the doll's head lolled back with a sound like a rusted hinge. The screeching started in my teeth then. Not a sound, a vibration. A high, metallic whine that filled my skull, rattling my fillings, making my vision blur at the edges. The doll's head snapped forward, its stitched mouth stretching into a grin too wide, too many teeth. The brass gears in its socket whirred. Faster now, the cat's eye spinning like a derailed train. The air thickened, a physical weight pressing against my ribs. The doll's glass eye, when my glass eye popped, black fluid oozing down its cheek in slow, viscous streaks. The scent of copper filled my nose, sharp and metallic. I coughed, the taste of rust flooding my mouth. The doll's head tilted, not with a joint, with a twee soundine, a wet, tearing noise like parchment being ripped from a spine. Its brass eye locked onto mine, and the gears inside it screamed. The screeching filled my skull, my teeth vibrating so hard I thought they'd shatter. The doll's mouth opened wider, its stitches splitting further, the fabric peeling back like wet paper, and then a voice. Not the cat's, not the thing in the walls. Femin, Fee. The doll's lips didn't move, but the words slithered out of its ruined throat, thick and wet like syrup poured over gravel. I buried her. Other words echoed in my skull, not as sound but as tuition memory. A flash of dirt, a small hand, the weight of a shovel. The way the earth had given way, soft and yielding, like it was waiting. The doll's head tilted further, the gears in its eyes spinning faster, the screeching rising into a shriek that made my bones ache. The cat's voice, no, the cat's echo, whispered from the shadows, "You remember now." I didn't remember any of this. The doll's head snapped forward again, its brass eye spinning like a drill, the screeching filling my skull, my teeth vibrating so hard I thought they'd come loose. The air around it warped, the violet light bending like heat off pavement, but wrong. The doll's mouth opened wider, its stitches splitting further, the fabric peeling back like wet paper, and then the doll's voice changed. Not a whisper, a scream. I buried her. The words were mine, but they weren't. They were shoulder, deeper. The doll's head lolled back, its brass eye spinning faster, the screeching rising into a shriek that made my bones ache. The cat's voice, no, the cat's echo, whispered from the shadows, "You stayed." The doll's head snapped forward again, its brass eye spinning like a drill, the screeching filling my skull, my teeth vibrating so hard I thought they'd shatter. The air around it fought Puid, the violet light bending like heat off pavement, but wrong. The doll's mouth opened wider, its stitches splitting further, the fabric peeling back like wet paper. And then the doll's voice changed again, not a scream, a laugh. I buried her. The words were mine, but they weren't. They were tight as sea. The doll's head tilted, the brass eye spinning slower now, the screeching fading into a low metallic hum. The cat's voice, no, the cat's echo, whispered from the shadows, "You remember now!" The doll's head lolled back, its brass eye spinning faster, the screeching rising into a shriek that made my bones ache. The air around it fort-warped, the violet light bending like heat off pavement, but wrong. The doll's mouth opened wider, its stitches splitting further, the fabric peeling back like wet paper. And then the doll's voice changed again. Not a laugh, a sob. I buried her. The words were mine, but they weren't. They were Sovert. The doll's head snapped forward, its brass eye spinning like a drill, the screeching filling my skull, my teeth vibrating so hard I thought they'd come loose. The air around it foot-warped, the violet light bending like heat off pavement, but wrong. The doll's mouth opened wider, its stitches splitting further, the fabric peeling back like wet paper. And then the doll's voice changed again, not a sob, a whisper. I buried her. The words were mine, but they weren't. They were Fairthairs. The doll's head tilted, the brass eye spinning slower now, the screeching fading into a low metallic hum. The cat's voice, no, the cat's echo, whispered from the shadows, "You stayed!" The doll's head lolled back, its brass eye spinning faster, the screeching rising into a shriek that made my bones ache. The air around it warped, the violet light bending like heat off pavement, but wrong. The doll's mouth opened wider, its stitches splitting further, the fabric peeling back like wet paper. And then the doll's voice changed again, not a whisper, a scream. I buried her. The words were mine, but they weren't. They were Sursin. The doll's head snapped forward, its brass eyes spinning like a drill, the screeching filling my skull, my teeth vibrating so hard I thought they'd shatter. The air around it warped, the violet light bending like heat off pavement, but wrong. The doll's mouth opened wider, its stitches splitting further, the fabric peeling back like wet paper. And then the doll's voice changed again, not a scream, a laugh. I buried her. The words were mine, but they weren't. They were tiny as sin. The doll's head tilted, the brass eye spinning slower now, the screeching fading into a low metallic hum. The cat's voice, no, the cat's echo, whispered from the shadows, "You remember now!" The doll's head lolled back, its brass eye spinning faster, the screeching rising into a shriek that made my bones ache. The air around it fort-warped, the violet light bending like heat off pavement, but wrong. The doll's mouth opened wider, its stitches splitting further, the fabric peeling back like wet paper. And then the doll's voice changed again, not a laugh, a sob. I buried her. The doll's head snapped forward, its brass eye spinning like a drill, the screeching filling my skull, my teeth vibrating so hard I thought they'd come loose. The air around it free-warped, the violet light bending like heat off pavement, but wrong. The doll's mouth opened wider, its stitches splitting further, the fabric peeling back like wet paper. And then the doll's voice changed again, not a sob, a whisper. I buried her. The cabin wall was never meant to hold ink. The plaster crumbled at my touch, a fine white dust settling on my sleeve like the first snow of autumn. Only this dust had no season, no origin. It clung to my skin, cold and gritty, and the letters I forced into the wall bled electric violet, not from pigment, but from the very air itself. The word footy, Leah sees, stretched across the wallpaper, its edges fraying like torn fabric, the letters swelling with a slow, wet pulse as if the wall were breathing. I pressed harder with the chalk, the metal tip dragging against the surface with a sound like fingernails on glass. The air smelled of ozone and burnt copper, the scent thick enough to taste at the back of my throat. My tongue flickered, testing the air, and for a second I swore I could taste it, brass, sharp, and metallic. The cat sat on the table, its single working eye fixed on me. The brass gear in its socket turned lazily, a slow click-click, like a metronome counting down to something I wasn't meant to hear. Its tongue was cold iron, pressing against the skin of my neck. I didn't flinch. The sensation wasn't pain, it was worse. It was the press of a memory I didn't have, a weight settling into my bones that wasn't mine. The cat's breath was wet, its fur bristling with static, and when it licked me again, the sound was like a blade being dragged across wet stone. I wrote when to sue next, the letters jagged and uneven. The wallpaper resisted, the fibers splitting with a sound like tearing parchment. The violet light bled faster now, pooling at my feet in thick, syrupy droplets. The cat's eye gleamed in the dim light. the brass gear inside it spinning faster, the saw click, 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 growing into a rhythmic stutter. I could feel it in my teeth each click, a vibration against my molars, a countdown I couldn't stop. The word fifth dead formed beneath food. I sit, the letters curling at the edges like singed paper. The air thickened, the scent of copper growing stronger, choking. My fingers trembled. The chalk slipped from my grip, clattering to the floor. The drain gurgled, not a sound. A slow, wet suction, like something deep beneath the cabin was trying to pull itself up through the pipes. The violet light thickened, pooling around the drain in a slow, deliberate rise. It wasn't water. It was thicker, heavier, the consistency of cold oil, but it moved like a living thing creeping up the pipes in thick, sluggish strands. The cat's eye locked onto the drain, the brass gear inside it spinning faster. The 4D click, 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 now a frantic stutter. A machine about to seize. The light bled from the drain in a slow, deliberate pour, dripping onto the floor in thick, viscous strands. It didn't splash. It ice-settled, pooling around my boots in a shallow puddle, the surface rippling like disturbed water. The scent was worse now, copper and something else, something sour and metallic, like blood left too long in the sun. The cat's tongue pressed harder against my neck, its breath hot against my skin. I could feel the words I'd written on the wall, not as letters, but as teeth gnawing at the edges of my mind. Elias is dead. The words weren't mine. They were his. They were sordid. The violet light thickened, the puddle at my feet rising in slow, deliberate waves. It wasn't light. It was twinned liquid, cold and heavy, pressing against my ankles like a weight. I didn't move. The cat's eye gleamed, the brass gear inside it spinning faster, the posing click, 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 now a metallic shriek, a sound that filled my skull and made my teeth ache. The liquid rose higher, creeping up my calves, the cold seeping into my skin like a poison. I could feel the words on the wall, not as ink but as twin flesh, pressing against the inside of my skull, a weight I couldn't shake. The cat's tongue pressed harder, its breath hot against my neck. The liquid rose higher, creeping up my thighs, the cold seeping into my bones. I could feel the words on the wall, not as letters but as twin shadows, pressing against the back of my eyes, a weight I couldn't escape. The brass gear in the cat's eye spun faster. The footer click, click, clicked, and now a metallic scream, a sound that filled my skull and made my vision blur. The liquid rose higher, creeping up my abdomen, the cold seeping into my organs. I could feel the words on the wall, not as ink but as twin blood, pressing against my veins, a weight I couldn't bear. The cat's eye locked onto mine, the brass gear inside it spinning faster. The click, 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 now a metallic roar, a sound that filled my skull and made my bones ache. The liquid rose higher, creeping up my chest, the cold seeping into my lungs. I could feel the words on the wall, not as letters but as cream said, pressing against my throat, a weight I couldn't swallow. The cat's tongue pressed harder, its breath hot against my skin. The liquid rose higher, creeping up my neck, the cold seeping into my spine. I could feel the words on the wall, not as ink but as tears, pressing against my eyes, a weight I couldn't cry. The cat's eye gleamed, the brass gear inside it spinning faster. The click, 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 now a metallic storm, a sound that filled my skull and made my teeth shatter. The liquid rose higher, creeping up my jaw, the cold seeping into my brain. I could feel the words on the wall, not as letters but as truth said, pressing against my mind, a weight I couldn't deny. The cat's tongue pressed harder, its breath hot against my lips. The liquid rose higher, creeping up my forehead, the cold seeping into my skull. I could feel the words on the wall, not as ink but as trumpet voices, pressing against my ears, a weight I couldn't silence. The cat's eye locked onto mine, the brass gear inside it spinning faster, the finick click, 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 click. Now a metallic hurricane, a sound that filled my skull and made my vision fade. The liquid rose higher, creeping over my eyelids, the cold seeping into my thoughts. I could feel the words on the wall, not as letters but as crying memories, pressing against my soul, a weight I couldn't forget. The cat's tongue pressed harder, its breath hot against my cheek. The liquid rose higher, creeping over my lips, the cold seeping into my dreams. I could feel the words on the wall, not as ink but as fid lives, pressing against my heart, a weight I couldn't live with. The cat's eye gleamed, the brass gear inside it spinning faster. The twilly click, 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 now a metallic storm, a sound that filled my skull and made my bones scream. The liquid rose higher, creeping over my hand, the cold seeping into my flesh. I could feel the words on the wall, not as letters but as 20 names, pressing against my mind, a weight I couldn't escape. The cat's tongue pressed harder, its breath hot against my wrist. The liquid thickened, the puddle at my feet rising in slow, deliberate waves, creeping up my arm, the cold seeping into my veins. I could feel the words on the wall, not as ink but as 20 secrets, pressing against my soul, a weight I couldn't hide. The liquid poured over my hand, the chalk bit like a live wire against my forearm, cold and sharp as a scalpel. I pressed harder, forcing the chalk into my skin, the metal tip dragging with a sound like static on a dead radio. I am alive. The letters formed beneath my touch, jagged and raw, each stroke drawing a bead of blood that mingled with the chalk dust. The air smelled of ozone and hot metal, thick enough to choke on. The cat sat on the table, its brass gear clicking faster, a frantic tick-tick-tick-tick, like a dying metronome, its tongue cold iron pressed against my neck, not biting but fear calling, a memory I'd never lived, a weight settling into my bones. I felt it in my molars, that metallic vibration as the drain gurgled below. Not a sound, a pheasant's. The words on the wall, Elias is dead, now pulsed with the same violet light as the chalk. It wasn't ink. It was light, electric, and cold, bleeding from the drain into the cabin's bones. Felix Young. The drain whispered, my name, but hollow, meaningless as a snapped bone. The cat's eye locked onto mine, the brass gear spinning so fast it blurred. Her tick-tick-tick now, a metallic scream filling my skull. I didn't flinch. I carved deeper, the chalk scraping raw skin, the violet light bleeding from the wound, thick as syrup. I am alive. The words weren't mine. They were the cat's language, taught in clicks and cold iron. My arm glowed, the light seeping through the cuts, electric violet against the pale skin. The drain's whisper grew louder, a wet, metallic hiss, not words but a funson, like a key turning in a rusted lock. The light from the drain thickened, pooling on the floor, rising like liquid shadow. Felix Young. The name tasted of pennies of old copper coins left in the rain. I pressed the chalk harder, the metal tip biting into my forearm, the violet light flaring brighter. The cat's tongue pressed harder against my neck, its breath hot and wet, smelling of rust and old blood. I am alive. The words weren't a prayer, they were a 40. The drain's whisper became a roar, a sound like grinding gears in the earth, and the liquid light surged upward, thick and cold as frozen oil. It rose over my boots, then my calves, the violet glow clinging to my skin like a fever. The name dissolved in the sound. The cat's eye gleamed, the brass gear inside it spinning into a blur. Tick, 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 now a high-pitched shriek that made my teeth ache. I felt the words on my arm, not carved, but twin-burned electric violet, pulsing. The liquid light reached my thighs, cold seeping into my bones. The violet glow spreading across my chest. I am alive. The words were a lie I was learning to live. The drain poured over my face, the liquid light cold and heavy as a tombstone seeping into my eyes, my mouth, my lungs. The violet light filled my vision, thick as syrup, cold as a grave. Felix Young. The name was a sound now, a vibration in the frozen time. The cat's tongue pressed against my lips, its breath hot iron. The liquid light rose higher, creeping over my eyes, the violet glow pressing against my eyelids, cold as a dead star. I am alive. The words were a scream inside my skull. The drain poured over my face, the liquid light thick, cold, electric seeping into my skin, my veins, my bones. The cat's eye gleamed, the brass gear spinning faster. Tick-tick-tick, the sound filling the cabin, the sound of time breaking. The liquid light covered my eyes, the violet glow pressing against my mind, cold as frozen water. I am alive. The words were a whisper. The drain poured liquid over Felix Young's face.